I was going for a nightly walk through the woods. It was just for fun. But what I saw that night was the opposite of fun. As I was walking, I got about 2 miles before I started hearing this loud panting noise from behind me. So, I started to move faster. About 30 minutes later, I heard a deer squeal and a loud bark, and then the forest went completely quiet. I turned around to see if I could see anything, and that's when I saw an 11-foot tall monster about a yard away from me. It had the head of a wolf, the color of a Doberman pinscher, and its body, well, it looked like it was a bodybuilder. Naturally, I stepped back in fear, and then this thing took one step towards me, and it was within inches from my chest. I saw its giant teeth sticking out of its snout. I swear, the mass of the head of this thing and the broad shoulders was enough to dwarf me. I was thinking I was gonna die, but then I heard this blood-curdling howl from the forest, and it took off. The howl must have been from another one of these things, because within moments, this monster was gone. I was glad to be alive. I got the hell out of there as fast as I could. I've never seen it since, and I hope I don't. Thanks for listening. I'm 44 years old now, and I've had 2 incidences in my life where I'm absolutely confident I saw a large, hairy wolf or wolf-like creature. The first one was in the 1970s, and I was rather young, maybe 7 or 8 at the most. The creature was looking at me in my bed on a night that was quite stormy before I saw it. I remember how big and broad it was, and how it stood on 2 legs, just like a human would. It was a dark night, but I could see this thing easily as it departed from the storm that was still close enough to flash lightning that lit up everything outside. The thing had a wolf face, yellowish eyes, but not bright yellow, not fluorescent like that either. More of a subdued yellow. It had pointy ears that seemed to keep moving through the whole experience, like he was twitching them all the time for some reason. It never snarled, never growled or howled, but it just looked at me from the outside of the glass. I was in bed, trying to settle down and go back to sleep after the storm, which rattled me as a kid. For some reason, I felt like I had to look outside. I turned over and sat up. I wasn't 20 feet from this thing, and separated only by a wrought iron door with the glass inside of it. I became terrified to the point I started yelling like mad. My grandmother and little sister were asleep in bed, even closer to the door, but at the angle, they couldn't sit up and see what I saw. I was literally scared out of my wits. I started screaming, and quickly my grandmother woke up, turned on a lamp, and then came over to me. Of course, she asked what was wrong. I was staring at the thing and could only point towards it. I couldn't speak a word. When I pointed, it started stepping back away from the door as my grandmother looked to see what scared me. She never said she saw it, but I'm confident she did. Her voice changed, and she woke up immediately. My sister woke up and was scared at this time, but she stayed in bed. She was younger than me, and she began crying. I saw the thing turn and move away, not at a fast pace, just stepped away and faded into the dark. All this commotion woke up my grandfather, who was flipping on lights as he came into the back room to see what was going on. My grandmother saw him enter the room, and he turned on the main light. At this instant, she told him to get his gun and go outside, because something was out there, and it scared me badly. He did as she said, because her voice was in a panic, and he knew something wasn't right. He went into his room and got a gun. You could hear him going into his closet. Then he went outside, turning on all manners of lights as he went, inside and outdoors. He was outside for about 10 minutes, and we could easily see him the whole time. He came in and talked low and right into my grandmother's ear. I didn't hear what was said that night, and I was still a scared wreck for the rest of the night. My grandfather slept in the back room with the rest of us, rifle still at his side as he lay on a different bed by himself. He left many lights on in the house, and all of them on outside. I could never get him to tell me what he saw or found, but before my grandmother died in 2003, she told me that when he went outside that night, he found big muddy footprints on the concrete, shaped like paw prints, but they were really big. She told me she'd stay up many nights after that, unable to sleep and worrying about her grandchildren. When I was in my teens and early 20s, I stayed with them often, especially on the weekends, but I never slept in that bed that faced the door again. And my grandmother actually made my grandfather's construction crew put a heavy wood door over that wrought iron door, so no one or no thing could ever look into it again. Some detail for good mental image. I live in a massive subdivision that surrounds a bunch of woods affectionately referred to around here as the trails. I suppose the people who own it left it untouched in case they wanted to add more streets. Anyway, I live down the street from one of the main entrances that most people use and know of. My friends and I were a resilient bunch who like to go out there and have fires, get drunk, and smoke a little. You know what I mean. We just wanted to have a little bit of fun. So considering we were out there so much, we decided we were going to build ourselves a little hideout, or fort of sorts, where we could party and even camp. We ended up with a good small clearing off on one of the winding paths where we had set up a good-sized lean-to, with some evergreen on top as our roof, and we named it Bear Cave. Now for the incident in question, this happened back when I was about 17 or 18 years old. I had just gotten off work and had gone to grab some fast food. My friends had called me earlier, letting me know we were going to meet out at Bear Cave. So after I got home, I changed into some warmer clothes, as this was during late fall or early winter, and it had been unusually cold that night. So I decided I should get out there as soon as possible, and decided to take my food with me and eat there. Now it's about 8:30, and the moon was barely visible through the trees, but knowing the trail like the back of my hand, I wasn't worried, and assumed they would already have a fire started. As I approached, I walked up to our hidden entrance, and saw there was no fire. I heard no sounds. I took my phone out and texted one of them, asking where they were. They replied something along the lines of, "Sorry man, we're gonna be about 15 minutes late." Great, I thought to myself. I ducked in, and started trying to scrape together some wood and kindling and get something started. Unfortunately, everything was wet, and without a proper flashlight, I couldn't get into the brush and dig anything out. This was before flashlights were standard on phones. Soon after that, I decided I might as well eat, and hurriedly scarfed down my 2 hamburgers. Before I knew it, it had been about 15 minutes, maybe even 20, and still, there was no sign of my friends. I tried giving a couple of them a call, and after 5 minutes with no callback, I texted them. Still no response. At this point, I was about fed up, and my phone was about to die. So I made a mental note. 10 more minutes, and I'm gone. At this point, I squatted down, holding my knees to my chest, and tried getting warm. My back was to our little hut at the back of the site. I thought I heard something behind me. A slight crunch. I looked over my shoulder, and from behind the shelter, I saw what looked like 2 beady eyes glinting from the little moonlight entering through the trees. I quickly and quietly turned my full body to face it. At this point, I felt as though I was about to throw up, or shit myself, or both. But, keeping my mind about myself, I slowly reached to my right, where I had laid a stick just in case something like this might happen. If this was a dog, it was big. And let me clarify, this was not a wolf, as I live in the South, and coyotes, they don't get as big as this thing was. Something wasn't right. It just stared at me, unblinking, as if it were staring right through me. I made no sound. This thing made no sound whatsoever. I realized that whatever this was, it wanted to come at me. Thinking fast, I decided my best interest was to throw it off guard. I threw the stick, and without even seeing if it made contact, I turned and ran as fast as I could out the entrance and placed my feet in all the safe spots that I knew of, assuring that I wouldn't trip and maintaining maximum speed. I didn't stop until I saw streetlights and was safely on the road. It was about this time I see my friends pulling up, and I told them all about everything that I had witnessed. They didn't seem too interested and tried to go out. I told them sternly no and suggested we just go to my house. This seemed suitable, and we went. I still don't know what it was that I saw out there, and it's like everyone forgot about it. I continued to go back out there, but only at the daytime, and if at night, only with friends, never alone again. But I'll never forget those unwavering eyes. What do you think it was? I'm an outdoorsman. I'm very experienced in hunting, camping, hiking, and general survival. I'm very familiar and used to wildlife, and I was charged by what I believe was a cryptid called a Dogman. When it charged me, it charged my cousin too. This was not a bear. A bear can't move how it did. It was not a normal wolf, as they can't comfortably run on two legs, whereas what charged us seemed natural at doing that. This happened around June or July of 2007. I was about 17 years old and more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night, it was wise to stay in the cabin, or at least by the bonfire by the beach, because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and the beach, and at night, you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy. That is until this incident. So this happened somewhere between 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo. He was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters into about a third of the way up that trail. We had enough at this point, and we were standing on the edge of a clearing on the trail, just talking. He was maybe 10 feet from me when I decided to mess with him. I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked. I started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. Now, I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf, as big as a black bear, and at least 300 pounds. It wasn't normal. This wolf was on two legs, crouching next to a tree, with its arm grasping the tree, grasping with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. I told my cousin, "We have to go." And the next thing I know, he's sprinting. And I look back at this wolf creature, who had locked on and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet. And then I turned and ran as well. Then, it looked like the wolf dropped to all fours. It charged at us and sounded right on our asses, barreling through the brush. But for whatever reason, it let us go. When we broke out of the tree line, we headed for the cabin. What stuck with me was the sheer size of this thing. It had to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright. And where it should have had front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. Now, I'm not sure how to explain this away rationally. I've heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs, nor do wolves get that big. And black bears more waddle on 2 legs. They don't sprint. The closest description I have of this thing is silly. It looked like a werewolf. That's the only encounter that I have. I know it's brief, but this is what happened to me, and why I believe that these things are real. Me, my 2 brothers, and his girlfriend were out enjoying a sunset at one of the many beautiful nature spots that we love to go to. There's a lake there, so my brothers were fishing, and the 2 of us watched them. We'd been there quite a while, and it was starting to get kind of dark, which usually means it's really dark inside the woods, and we still needed to walk back to the car. As we were getting ready to go, everything got dead silent. It was odd. Birds had went quiet. No sounds from squirrels, woodchucks, or any of the previous background noises from earlier. Nothing. After what seemed like forever, but in reality could have been possibly just a couple of seconds, out of nowhere, we hear this howling and yipping from coyotes, and they didn't sound too far away. In fact, it sounded like there could have been 20 of them. My brother picked up his 12 gauge, and he told us all to move quickly. If those coyotes were hungry and in a pack that big, we could be in some trouble. We were in full sprint back to the car. The coyotes sounded like they were getting closer and closer. At one point, it sounded like they were right on our tail. It was pretty scary. It seemed like they were after us at the time, but when I think back, I think they were running from something too. No coyotes attacked us. We'd stopped to get into the car. We kept hearing them, but they never attacked us. On the way home, you have to drive by this guardrail. On the other side of that guardrail is a 70-foot drop into a sheep farm in our area. We rounded this part where it turns and you can't see around the turn. And when we did, we came up on this big, hairy creature. It had pointy ears like a German shepherd's. It had piercing, greenish-yellow eyes, and the eyes were separated just like a human's. The arms hung down to his knees, and he appeared to be at least 8 feet tall and hunched over. We came around the bend, and my brother stopped in the middle of the road. This thing looked at us through our headlights while we were trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It didn't look like a bear. What the hell else could it be then? After a few seconds, this thing turns back, takes one hand and lifts himself up over the guardrail and over the 70-foot drop down. All of this was in one swift motion. We were all so creeped out, we didn't want to go look. We couldn't see anything anyways because it was so dark. So we just kept driving home. The next day, me and my brother went to the farm at the bottom of that 70-foot drop to see if we could find anything that could have jumped over it. We told them what we'd seen, and if we could maybe walk to the back of the property to see if we could find any remains, as anything that jumped over that was sure to have died. As we were walking, the farmer was telling us about sheep that had been coming up dead with their throats torn out. He said it was the strangest thing, because most of the game in the area hunt for food to eat. These attacks seemed vicious, without purpose, and that was the weird thing. He also told us that the saliva tested around the neck of one of the sheep, it tested positive for some kind of unknown canine. Any suggestions on what it could have been? A bear is ruled out. All 4 of us agree on that. There's no way a bear could have had those features that that thing had. It was scary human looking. Bigfoot? I thought he was supposed to be a nice species. My personal opinion is that we saw a real-life werewolf. The others are much more skeptical than I am, though. So let me know what you think. That Dogman that everybody's talking about? Yeah, I saw him. Hell, he almost killed me. Not because he tried to eat me or maul me to death. Not because I got too close to him and ran into him in the middle of the forest. But because he almost caused me to crash my car into a tree. I was driving home one night from work. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning in Mississippi. All of a sudden, this big-ass werewolf-looking thing runs right out in front of me. Now, the road I was driving down, it's 2 lanes. One coming, one going. This thing cleared that road in 2 steps. It was gigantic. Way taller than my car. I'm thinking 8 feet, hell, maybe even taller. So it runs right out in front of me. Maybe 5 feet away. Of course, I slam on my brakes and I swerve, trying not to hit this thing. At this point, I saw what it was. I saw what it looked like. But my brain didn't register what I was looking at. All my brain was trying to do was cause me to not hit this thing. Hell, my car wasn't even paid off yet. So there was no way I was trying to hit this big monster that was running in front of me. I didn't want to jack up my car. It was wet out, so of course I started sliding all over the place. Cranked the wheel the other way to try to counteract the way that I was spinning, but it didn't really do a lot of good. I spun right off the road and came within a few feet of running into this big-ass tree. Like a dumbass, I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. I was just enjoying a cool night's ride, smoking a cigarette, listening to my music, when all of a sudden, the Wolfman runs right out in front of me. I finally stopped. I started cursing as soon as I started spinning. Said some things I shouldn't have. But as soon as I was stopped, that's when my brain started to register just what I saw. Like I said, this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. It had gray fur, a big snout. He didn't look at me. He just kept running straight ahead. So I didn't see his whole face, but I saw the side. I saw the side of his muzzle. It was long, and he had this big black nose on the end of it. His ears looked pointed. They were big, and they had little tufts of fur on the ends. You asked me what his legs looked like? They looked just like a dog's or a wolf's. Like he was running on his toes. I know a lot of people say that the legs bend backwards, but really that's not what dogs' legs look like at all. They just walk on their toes, so their ankles bend back, making them look like their knees are bent backwards. But in reality, that's not their knees at all. It's just their ankles. Regardless though, that's what his legs looked like. He had this big bushy tail. It was all gray. There was no other color on this entire creature. And the way he was running, his arms were bent at the elbows, just like a person would run if they were running really fast. Bent at the elbows, going back and forth, and his hands were out, if that's what you want to call them. The fingers on this thing were long, and I could see the claws. How I got so much detail in the couple of seconds I saw this thing is beyond me. I guess the brain just works in mysterious ways. But I know what I saw. His chest was gigantic, like a bodybuilder, and his legs were just as buff. He had a long torso, and his arms were really long too. That's about all I saw of this thing. So back to the almost crash. So I'm sitting there, trying to collect myself, trying to get my heart from beating out of my chest. I look up, hoping to God that I don't see this thing, but more than expecting to see it. At first, my headlights, they just shined through the mist that was collecting on the ground and in the air around me. And then I saw part of this thing, but just a part. I saw these glowing, amber-colored eyes. They look just like a dog or a cat when the light hits them and they reflect. That was enough to snap me out of the fog that I was in myself, get my car started again, and get the hell out of there. I backed up probably a good 200, 300 feet, making sure that this thing wouldn't chase after me. Finally, I popped it back and drove away. My theory, this thing knew I was coming. It knew what it was doing. They're smart. Maybe this thing was trying to get me to crash. Maybe that's the way it hunted. If I crashed my car and it couldn't move, there was no way I could outrun this thing, especially after seeing how fast it moved and how quickly it got across the street. That leg span, there was no way I was outrunning it. So maybe that's what it does. Maybe it runs out in front of you, makes you crash, and then eats you. There's been more than one missing person around here. And I hate to say it, but I think maybe these things are responsible for them. Or maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe this thing isn't hunting at all. Maybe it was just having fun. It didn't run out there on accident. That road is a straight shot for about 3 miles. It ran out in front of me on purpose. Maybe it just wanted to scare me. Or maybe it even just wanted me to know that it exists. I'm never going to know what it wants. I don't even drive down that road anymore. Hell, I don't even live in the town anymore. I got out of there about 6 months later because I got transferred in my job. Lots of people would think that I'd be mad about it, but after seeing that thing, I was relieved that I got to leave. So that's about all I saw. I never saw it again. I know some people that talk about seeing things like that. I'll try to get their stories for you too. But thank you for taking the time to listen to me, so I could tell you exactly what I saw. It wasn't a man in a suit. It wasn't a bad dream. I wasn't hallucinating. This thing really ran out in front of me and almost caused me to die by crashing into a tree. So everybody that drives in the middle of the night on deserted roads, or out in the country, or out in the woods, just watch your surroundings. Because who knows when you can be the next victim of this thing running out in front of you. Good night. I was camping in the Daniel Boone National Forest with my little brother when something unbelievably supernatural happened to us. For this story, I changed his name, because he's only 17 now. At the time, I was 23. Tim was only 12. Our parents were always fighting back then, and I felt as his big brother it was my duty to protect him and get him away from there as much as I could. I asked him what he wanted to do for the weekend, and he said he wanted to go camping. I thought it was a great idea. So, I got up into the attic and got all of our camping stuff. I found a great spot to go camping. Or, so I thought. When we got there, we put our tent up, and we'd been there all day long. We went for a little hike, cooked some burgers, played catch with our mitts. It was a great time. He was really excited to get a campfire going, because he wanted to tell me scary stories. He was big into the Goosebumps Most Wanted books back then, and thought he could tell me a really scary one. We started gathering wood around 3. I wanted to get everything set up for the campfire early, so we didn't have to worry about it later. While we were gathering wood, all the sounds of the forest just stopped all at once. It was the eeriest thing I've ever experienced. It's like when you walk by a cricket and it stops chirping, but this was the whole forest. Birds, bugs, frogs, whatever other kind of animals were out there, just collectively shut up, all at the same time. I'm not gonna lie, that was enough to give me goosebumps. I didn't need to hear any story. I called Tim over and told him to stay by me. He protested. He wanted to collect his own wood, but I told him I wouldn't listen to his story if he didn't stay by me. I looked around, but I didn't see anything. I really just wished he said he wanted to go to a ball game instead of camping. Probably 10 minutes later or so, we were at camp, and I just happened to see movement up in this really big tree. I'd say it was about 9 feet up. I looked at the tree and stared for a long moment, but I didn't see anything for the longest time. Then this face caught my eye, and I almost yelled in shock. It was this big wolf head peering out of the branches. We're talking huge, like the size of a lion's head. A lot of people that encounter Dogman say it looked like a German Shepherd or a Doberman. This thing looked like a wolf. It had long shaggy hair, like a gray wolf. Its ears were triangular, not long and pointed. It had a big muzzle, and its mouth was closed. It had a black nose on the end of that muzzle. It had that grayish-brown fur that wolves have. To me, it looked like, well, it looked like a werewolf, to be honest. I stared at it longer because I really thought it was just a mask or something else that somebody had put there to scare other people. That's how still this thing was. But the eyes, they didn't look fake. I could see the sun reflecting off of them. And this thing looked like it was staring right at us. Then this thing opened its mouth ever so slightly, and I knew that it was real. I knew I had to get Tim out of there. I knew that there was a chance this thing would come after us, and I couldn't risk my baby brother's life or the safety of him. I told him we needed more wood, and that I'd seen a big pile when we were driving in, but we'd need to drive the truck over there to get it. I grabbed a few things and threw them in the truck, but left the tent and everything else there. Luckily, we hadn't started the fire yet. Once we got into the car and drove a little bit away, I told him we couldn't go back, and that I'd seen something that I thought was a big bear, and it was close to our camp. That scared him enough to not want to go back, so luckily I didn't have to argue with him or tell him what I had really seen. In fact, I didn't tell him the truth for 3 years until he was 15, and I knew he could handle it. He was confused when I told him, since, these things aren't supposed to exist. But then we read about the Michigan Dogman, and I think he accepted it a little bit more. I still got a lot of no ways and yeah rights, but I know he believes me. What's crazy is that I only saw its head. No shoulders or body or hands, nothing. I'm not sure if it was up in that tree or if it was just tall enough to be standing there looking through the branches. I've heard about some incredibly tall dogman, so I wouldn't be surprised. But either way, that thing either had great camouflage in its coat, or it could cloak itself. It took me a few days to muster up the courage to go back and get our things, and even then, I didn't go back without a couple of my buddies, and I took a rifle with me. Before this encounter, if you told me these things were real, I would have asked you if you were on drugs. But now I know there's things out in the world that exist that aren't supposed to.
My name is Landon. Currently, I live in California, though this encounter happened in Astoria, Oregon. I'm not really sure how to start this, but I am a fan of your work, and I've seen all of your videos. When I was younger, I loved the outdoors. I stayed in the forest nearly every weekend, either alone or with some friends. Over the summer, I began working on a cabin with some of those friends. Now, I've never believed in any type of paranormal creature, though I am a fan of fantasy reading and horror movies. But still, I never gave any of them more than a second glance. Where the cabin is, I brought up friends there often. They said they would see strange things, but I would talk them out of it, explaining that they were simply normal animals. Some, however, refused to return due to what they had seen. One night, towards the end of the summer, I got together a group of my friends. Richard, Monty, Chris, Oscar, and myself, and we all decided to take the hour-long hike from my house to the cabin that I'd built. Richard was late, so we couldn't leave until just before sundown. As we started going up, Monty pointed out rustling noises behind us. I noticed them as well, but I quickly dismissed them as a rabbit or something. We continued on, and when we were nearly to the cabin, we all heard a long crash to the right. Now, our trail wove through dense forest and along the side of a hill, so it sounded like this thing was on top of that hill. And then it shifted, and we heard rustling heading our way. Nothing was there, though. Our flashlights illuminated the entire area, so we could see around us. At this point, even I was beginning to get freaked out, but I quickly reassured myself that whatever it was, it wouldn't attack all these people at once. Then the growling started. Well, I guess you could call it a growl. It was almost like a chuckle. We debated whether or not to go home, or just go to the cabin, which at this point was only 10 minutes away. So we sped up. We quickened our pace to the cabin, not eager to find out what the source of that noise was. Then, a sudden noise came from our left. I know you probably get this a lot, and at this point, it's almost going to sound cliche, but the noise I heard sounded exactly like the howl from an American Werewolf in London. Then, this huge black shape walked into the path. I was closest to it, but Monty noticed it first. "Run! There's a mountain lion," he said. I turned and said, "What? Where?" And you never run from a mountain lion. But when I turned back, this mountain lion was something else. And it was standing on two legs. It looked me right in the eye. It had these golden eyes, and it had the head of a wolf, but much, much taller. I'm 6'3", and I wasn't even near his shoulder height. It seemed to be very muscular, but lean, similar to an Olympic runner. The fur was black, but non-reflective, much like coal. I couldn't see if it had a tail, but I would imagine so. It had a long muzzle with long pointed ears. I'd say it had to be at least 8 feet tall, but it could have easily been bigger. I turned to run and noticed I was the only one still in the area. I took off as fast as I could. My lungs were burning. I couldn't feel my legs, but I kept going. I could hear it behind me. Its heavy footsteps were sloshing in the wet mud. Eventually, the footsteps ended, and civilization grew closer. My friends were now within sight, and I eventually caught up to them. We all agreed on what we'd seen, but none of us wanted to tell anyone. And to this day, you are the first to know. I haven't gone back since then. Now that I think about it, there was a smell. We were joking that Chris had farted about 5 minutes prior to the encounter. I feel there was no way it was running as fast as it could. It sounded like it was running on its hind legs, and it seemed to be covering 5 times the distance I was with each step. I believe this is the only sighting in the area, but I have found many strange dead animals in the area. In my backyard, a few weeks later, there was actually a mutilated headless deer. And a few months prior to my encounter, I found a dead black bear that was ripped to shreds in its own den. I mentioned that to my dad, and he reassured me that it was just another bear, that nothing else in the woods could have done that. The last visit up there before my encounter, it was just Richard and I, and he mentioned that same growl laugh, which he later confirmed to be the same thing we heard during the encounter. Dear Supernaturalist,
Let me start by saying I'm a huge fan, and I've been meaning to email you my encounter with the unknown. Ever since I can remember, I've had run-ins with the supernatural or some kind of cryptid. A little about myself. I'm a native Californian, and I'm from some of the tougher parts of LA, so not a stranger to violence, and I'm not scared easily. I'm 6'1", about 200 pounds, adventurous, and very inquisitive. When I first moved to Texas from California, I worked the night shift at IKEA. Not the best schedule, but I needed money to support my wife and kids. Being a recent transplant, I didn't yet have a toll tag, so I had to take Service Road FM 3040 to get back home. If you know what road I'm speaking of, you know there's a heavy wooded area on both sides of this road. My encounter took place a little past midnight on my way home when I caught something on the right side of the road coming from the woods. The first thing I saw were 2 yellow eyes. This thing was huge. Being my curious self, I rolled my window down, only to hear branches breaking, heavy panting, and footsteps, so clear they deafened the sound from the nearby highway. As soon as I rolled my window down, I got a really funky smell. The best I can describe it as would be like a pond that has a lot of algae mixed with wet dog. My first glimpse at this thing was on 3 legs, crouching down with its front left arm leaning up against the tree it was next to. It must have heard my car or something, because when I rolled my window down, it stood up, towering up to what I would say was 8 feet tall, and it looked like it was grinning at me with a short, broad snout. This thing was built like a tank. Its weight had to be close to 700 or 800 pounds. This thing was covered in dark tan hair with a patch missing near the stomach area. It had long pointy ears, and the eyes were reflective, just like a lion or any other type of predatory animal at night, and it had a yellowish tint to them. Once it stopped leaning against the tree, its left arm came down with its hands passing its weird dog-looking knees. The legs looked just like a dog, heel up, walking on its toes. I knew this monster would tear me up with those huge hands and its long fingernails. I mean, this thing was built to tear up anything that stood in its way. I began to drive off. It got on all fours and began chasing my car. It ran alongside my car for about 30 seconds, so probably about a quarter mile, and it was on the edge of the woods. I honked my horn. It turned towards me, showing its sharp rows of teeth, and it leapt into the tree line. That's when I saw the tail, when it hopped into the first tree. It was long, covered in hair, and curved in the middle. At this point, I rolled my window back up, asking myself what the hell I just saw. It's impossible. No way does something like that exist. From what I caught on my side and rearview mirrors, it jumped into 5 trees. Then it let out the loudest howl I've ever heard. That was this thing's way of telling me to leave. It made the hairs on my arms stand and sent chills down my spine. It was the most bone-chilling, deep, angry howl that I've ever heard. I mean, this thing sounded hella angry. I could still hear it down the road over the freeway traffic, my engine, and the radio. After I got away from it, I still had about 20 minutes until I reached my apartment. But I started to get paranoid, and I drove around, fooling myself into thinking that I wouldn't lead this thing to my home. The rest of the way home, I kept looking back in my rearview mirror, thinking this thing was behind me. Ever since that day, I go early to go throw my garbage outside, since behind my house, there's a wooded area, and I get the feeling it might have had my scent and might be stalking me. Anytime I pass by this area, I wonder if that thing is looking at me. Thank you for taking the time to read it, and I hope you find it interesting. I do believe what I saw was a Dogman. Submitted by Hulk Smash. I lived alone in this remote location. We didn't have cable, and the only option was satellite TV. It was a humid summer night in July, and the TV was acting up, so I needed to go out and readjust the satellite like usual. I took a flashlight and a gun with me. When I went outside, it was unusually quiet. Like, so silent it was unnerving. I brushed the thought off and went to the dish, which is in the corner of my yard. I went to work, making sure all the wires were all right and pointing it in different angles. Suddenly, I heard the small snap of a stick to my left and turned the flashlight to the direction. I saw a creature, just standing there. I got a good look at it for what seemed like an eternity, but it was really only for about 10 seconds. I slowly backed off and ran back to the house and locked all the doors and windows. The creature that I saw was unlike anything that I've ever seen before. When I shined the light at it, the first thing I saw was the head. It had cropped ears that pointed upwards. Its snout was narrower than a bear's and longer, but I could make out large teeth protruding from the jaw. Its eyes were a deep red shade that seemed to reflect off the light that I was pointing at it. The body was muscular and huge. It had long arms that appeared to be longer than its legs, broad shoulders that tapered into a skinnier waist. It was slightly crouched over when I saw it. It had one hand wrapped around a small tree. I could make out the legs, which looked similar to a dog's. It had obvious hocks. Even in the crouched position, it was about my height, which is 6 feet tall. Standing up to a full height, this creature could easily be 7.5 feet tall. The fur was black and thicker around the neck and chest, and the bottom was significantly less so. I don't know if it was aggressive or not. What I do know is I had a feeling of dread unlike anything I've ever experienced. Was it just observing me, or was it stalking me? For a creature this large, it was deceivingly silent. It got within 15 yards of me, and I didn't even notice. All I knew was I needed to get the hell out of there and not find out. I don't live on that property anymore, but after the event, I never had another face-to-face encounter. But I would hear sounds in the woods I couldn't explain. They'd start off relatively quiet and work their way up to a ferocious howl or scream, then back down to quiet again. I don't know if this was the same thing or not. I guess it could be a local wildlife creature. For the record, this encounter took place in Wise River, Montana. Back in the 1960s, when I was about 10 years old, my dad and uncle pooled all of their resources together and bought a brand new vacation home in Palm Springs, California. Our house was second from the corner. It was right across the street from a newly built golf course. This golf course had super tall trees lining the entire course and was about a mile long. The house itself had a large rectangular pool and an oversized backyard. It had 3 bedrooms, a living room, a dining room, a TV area, and a small kitchen with a pass-through bar. It had one long side facing the TV area. The kitchen also had a door to the pool and the backyard. That was at one end. The entrance from the dining room was at the other. On either side of the kitchen, there were 2 6-foot walls that were painted bright white. At the time of this encounter, we had no decorations on them, so everything I saw, I could see pretty clearly. To help when we had extra guests, we had 2 couches that folded out into double beds. One couch was in the TV area. The other was directly across from the kitchen entrance and was facing those 2 white walls. Just to the side of the dining room, we had a perpendicular couch to the other one. Whenever we had friends vacationing with us, their kids and I were most often assigned to sleep on the fold-out couches. I was on the one directly across from the kitchen entrance. Directly above this couch was a long, narrow window that was positioned about 7 feet high and was nestled right under the roofline. The window itself didn't open and was about 5 feet wide, but only about a foot tall, making the top of this window about 8 feet high. At night, the 2 walls looked very much like a theater screen whenever any headlights or moonlight came through that high-placed window. The window faced the same direction as the front door. We were one of the only few homes on the far east end of this block, so we were pretty isolated from any other home. At this point, There were no more than a dozen homes in the entire tract, including ours. The golf course was just about a block east of us, and was often vacant during the very hot summer months that we vacationed there. This course had huge, flat, tree-lined fairways. So, as you picture this, it's easy for some kind of creature, especially like the one I encountered, to make its way to and from without being seen. Since there was so much space all around us, as kids we had an absolute blast hunting lizards and field mice on hot summer days, along with any errant soda cans that we lever-locked our Daisy BB guns towards. All of the houses around here had granite rock instead of grass. Our granite rock was about 3 to 4 inches deep, and when you walked up it, it wasn't only difficult, it was really, really noisy. So whenever anybody was in that rock, you could hear them walking around clearly. We also had this 6-foot cinder block wall that was on both sides of the house and the backyard. Whenever we'd go out there, we'd either take our family, which was my 6 cousins plus all my aunts and uncles, or our family friends. Sometimes we'd go with one family, other times we'd go with more than one family. This time, it was just me and my mom and my brother. At the time, I was 11. My brother was only 6. And the boys that came with my mom's friend Jeannie were 9 and 11. During this vacation, I can remember the moon clearly. It always looked huge, and it was always bright. It was crystal clear weather. There was no wind. And every time that moon rose, it would shine into those windows perfectly. One night, after playing hard all day long, Chris, Greg, and I slept in that couch that was under the window. I was right in the middle. My brother, since he was only 6, slept in the master bedroom with my mom and Jeannie. At about 2 to 3 in the morning, I woke up because of the sound of low plodding. The footsteps were heavy, and I could hear the rocks crunching underneath them. They started all the way at the curb and became progressively louder as they got closer to our concrete walkway that was right at the entrance of the door. The crunching stopped, and then this creature reached the section leading to the front door. After a few seconds, the doorknob twisted slowly. It went one way, and then the other. And then it went back and forth a couple more times. It was always slow, never fast. Apparently, whatever this thing was trying to remain as silent as possible. Luckily, my mom always made sure that the doors were locked before we went to bed. We were pretty isolated out there. No one to help. So, my mom always wanted to make sure that we were extra safe. But, as the doorknob kept turning back and forth, I thought about what would happen if this thing got in, and I was on the verge of pissing my jammies. Once the doorknob stopped twisting, there was another long pause, until I heard the same heavy rock-crunching footsteps getting closer and closer to a point directly outside the wall that the couch backed up to, exactly where the 3 of us were sleeping. As it got near that high window, the moon began casting a clearly focused shadow directly onto the wall that I had mentioned, and I saw it right in front of me. With every rock-crunching step, it moved left to right, directly outside that window, bobbing and twisting its head, trying to get a good look inside. After a surprising amount of time, we're talking 4 or 5 minutes, whatever it was eventually gave up and left. But not without a lot more of the rock-crunching footsteps, until it was completely out of hearing range. We went out there to look before anyone else was up. We didn't want anyone or anything to change the evidence that might be out there. The rocks prevented any really accurate impressions, but you could clearly see there were large, very deep footprints from where it entered and exited the front yard, as well as the area that was trampled directly underneath that high window where it spent most of its time. The image that was cast on the wall was very tall, obviously. We're talking 7 or 8 feet. Maybe it was crouching down, so it was even taller. The sound it made when it walked was extremely heavy, and at a slow but very steady pace, like it was afraid of absolutely nothing, but was still trying to be as silent as possible. What was most interesting about the silhouette that I saw was the rounded top of the head, with absolutely no neck. It turned slightly while it was slowly bobbing up and down, trying to peer into the window. It had sharp pointed ears that went absolutely straight up, and they came a little closer together whenever it turned the side of its head. At the time, I thought it was a spaceman's helmet, but the more I think about it and the more I learn, I'm inclined to believe it was a Dogman. Because of the forested area by the golf course, I think this thing has the means of traveling so it wouldn't be seen. What do you think? Is there anybody else out there in Palm Springs or the surrounding area that's had a Dogman encounter? If so, please let the supernaturalist know so he can contact me and maybe we can share our stories together. One Saturday night, we had to go get milk for my baby brothers. So my mother and I went to the grocery store. By the time we got there, it was about 11 o'clock. When we left the store, I remember my mom thought we should go through this dark alleyway just so we could get home faster. We got about halfway there, and I heard leaves crushing behind me. Mom turned around to see what it was, but nothing was there. Once we got out of the alleyway, we could see our house. But then we heard this loud howl from behind us. I looked back, and I saw this monster. It was about 8 or 9 feet tall. This thing looked like a werewolf. It was buff, and it had these glowing reddish eyes with blue in them. It had sharp claws and brownish yellow fur. Luckily, it was about a block or so away from us, so we got home as fast as we could. Once we got inside, I told my mom, let's never go down that alleyway again. Okay, so let me start off by saying I live in a small parish called St. James in Louisiana, and this happened 5 years ago when I was 13 years old. I'm not going to waste time, but I need to get some help here. When I was 13, this happened. Me and my surrogate sister, I'll call her Jenny for privacy's sake, were leaving my church's youth group during the summer. It ended around 7 p.m., and it was still pretty sunny outside. We were maybe a block away from my church, at the storage unit. We were going to the car, and right in front of it, we saw this thing. It looked like a dog or coyote or something, but its front paws didn't touch the ground. In fact, it was moving around on 2 feet. It wasn't that big. It looked to be maybe 4 feet tall. It had brown and dark gray color. It actually moved around like one of those raptors in the Jurassic Park movies. We were both pretty shocked at this, and we drove over to investigate. We didn't find anything behind the units. I wouldn't be telling the story, but one day, after some prayer thing my folks did at church, my younger sister, me, Jenny, and Jenny's husband went to drive behind the back of the storage unit. It'd become a routine at this point to drive behind there, just in case that thing was back. We drove back there, and then Jenny's husband stopped the car, like jolted it to a stop. He said something large and brown had ran in front of the car. I saw it, he saw it, Jenny saw it, but my youngest sister hadn't. I was scared shitless now. Why did we go back there? Why couldn't we just leave this thing alone? Needless to say, after this, I'd been getting nightmares. The dreams were weird. They all took place at night, at my parents' church, and there were always wolves and coyotes in them, and some sort of dog-like creature, or werewolf. I would have countless dreams where this thing would hunt me down, and I was trapped at the church. It would always stalk outside the church, and it would always come after me. Maybe it's because I was a kid, but this shit frightened me for years, until I was 15. That was a recurring thing in a lot of my dreams. It would always hunt me. I would always try to get to the car to escape, but it would hunt me down. I guess it kind of died down for me after a while. I was so scared shitless by this that my mom said we couldn't drive behind the storage unit anymore. But to be honest, one of the weirdest things was on Halloween. We had this girl in my parents' church at the time called Belle. I don't know how the conversation started, but at that time, I had told most of the people I knew about this story, and they all thought I was crazy. Anyways, I was talking to Belle, and she told me she had seen that thing too, by the ditch that was right next to the storage unit. I asked her to draw it for me to see what it looked like, and it looked pretty much exactly like what I saw. Supernaturalist, I want to thank you for seeking me out and convincing me to tell you this story. A disclaimer before you tell this story. I want you to let your viewers know that I am an avid big game hunter, an angler. I've hunted big game almost my entire life. I've hunted all over the United States, in India, Africa, Canada. I go and I fish in Brazil, in Alaska. I deep sea fish. The bigger the fish, the fiercer the fight, the more I enjoy it. I'm a hunter. That's what I do. It's what I love. But what I saw out there in Canada that night, well, that was new. There's this place in Ontario. It's called Snellgrove Lake. I don't know if you've heard of it before, but it's really hard to get to. It's a pain in the ass. You actually have to take a plane to get there. And it's expensive. We're talking a couple of grand per person. So, when my little brother called me and told me we should go out there for a week of adventure, hunting and fishing, I was all for it. So him, myself, our older brother, and his dog Rocky all made the trip. The second night we were there is when I had the first of 3 encounters with a Dogman. Both of my brothers and Rocky were inside the house. I don't know what they were doing, but we had rented out this cabin for the week. I was sitting on the porch by myself, just having a drink, minding my own business, and exciting myself for the hunt that I was going to do in a couple of days. The first thing I noticed was that everything went extremely quiet, almost all at once. I've heard some of your other stories where it's described as a mute button being hit on TV. It wasn't exactly like that for me. If I had to describe it, it'd be more like somebody pushed the volume down on a TV and everything kind of quieted down little by little. But before I knew it, the forest was completely silent. That's when I saw someone walking up towards the cabin. He was walking slowly. I didn't know what he wanted, so I called out to him, "Hey friend, it's probably not a good idea to be sneaking up on a cabin out here, when you know the only people out here are huntsmen that like to carry guns." Still, this guy kept on slowly walking up to me. The next thing I noticed, mind you, at this point I could just see the silhouette of him, was he was a really big guy. We're talking a couple of feet taller than me, and I'm 6'2". Yet this guy, he looked like he could be the Big Show's little brother. Yet, he kept on walking, even after my warning. Then I could hear him breathing. It was this big, grunting breath, deep from his chest, and it didn't really sound natural. When he got close enough is when I saw this thing for what it really was. It wasn't a person at all. It was a big wolf man, or werewolf, or wolf beast, or something. It was huge. It had a gigantic head, and it looked just like a wolf. Like a gray wolf, except it wasn't gray. It was dark brown, and it had highlights of red in it. It had these big golden eyes that looked just like a dog. Ears on the top of its head. It had big, long, muscular arms, and the arms were really, really long. And the legs on this thing, man, he looked like he could squat a ton. And I'm not even exaggerating. This thing looked like it had done steroids its entire life. But the super creepy part was the legs went backwards, like a dog. The only thing I could do, as I stared at this thing, as I couldn't figure out what it was, because I knew it shouldn't exist, was get up slowly. And I slowly backed towards the door. When I got up, this thing stopped walking and just stared at me. I could see the teeth sticking out of its mouth. Big, sharp teeth. It kind of tilted its head at me, like it was trying to figure me out. Now, the very first lesson I ever learned when my dad taught me how to hunt, you don't run from any kind of predator. You move slowly. I'd been in situations before with bears where I got too close and I was acting dumb. That was back when I was a teenager, and believe me, I learned that lesson fast. You get too close to something and you're a dead man. So I wanted to get as much distance between me and this thing as possible, without showing any fear, without moving too fast and setting it off. So I slowly continued to make my way to the door. When I reached the door, I grabbed the handle and opened it slowly. What I want to stress to you, this thing was not afraid at all. I've hunted bear a lot. For the past 20 years, I've gone on bear hunts at least twice a year. They're not afraid of you either, but they're still cautious. They know that you're dangerous. They know they can kill you, but they're still cautious. This thing, it had no ounce of fear in it. It just continued to stare at me, and I continued to stare at it. We didn't take our eyes off of each other at all. I finally got inside. I slowly shut the door, and that's when I started to move fast. I was met by Rocky. He was shaking and whining. He was scared. I got my brothers. I told them what I'd seen. Both of these crazy sons of bitches wanted to go out and shoot at it. I told them it wasn't a good idea. We should stay inside. Luckily, I didn't have to argue. I didn't have to put up a fight. They agreed with me. All four of us stayed inside. The dog was the most scared of all of us. He was shaking and nervous the entire night, even though nothing happened the rest of the night. The next morning, I still wanted to go fishing. Call me crazy, but I had just spent a shit ton of money to get out here. And I knew if I was on the water, this thing most likely couldn't get to me. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, we got up and we went down to the lake. About 6:30 or so, we saw it again. This time, it was standing on the opposite bank, just outside of the trees, and it was watching us with that same head tilt that it was doing the night before. I honestly think this thing was curious. Maybe it had never seen man before. Like I said, at where we were, it's a pretty isolated area. We didn't see anybody else. Why should I think this thing's seen anybody ever, its entire life? My big brother asked me what that thing was doing. I looked at him and told him it was hunting us. That was enough to ruin that fishing trip. It's not like you can really enjoy it anymore after you've been stalked by a werewolf, right? So we decided maybe it was a better idea if we just went home. We went back to the cabin and contacted the guy that got us there. But, as fate would have it, we couldn't get out of there until the next day. So, we'd have to spend another night there with that thing. We drank a lot of coffee that night. All three of us stayed up the entire night, guns in hand, ready for war, in case this thing came back. I kept my eye on my watch to make sure that I could tell when we needed to leave, so we could get the hell out of there. At 2:18 a.m., Rocky started whining again. This poor dog, even though he was scared, I was personally grateful for that fear, because he was a kind of early warning system for us, letting us know that that monster was back outside. We peered out the windows. We couldn't see anything. It wasn't where it was the night before. We could have seen it if it was. There was nothing out there. But still, we had our guns ready. We were ready to light that son of a bitch up if it crossed us. I didn't know if our rifles could do anything, but I damn sure wasn't about to go out without a fight. If that thing was going to come in there and take us out, I was putting some bullets in that son of a bitch. Rocky settled down again after that, for a good 45 minutes, maybe even an hour. At 3:35 a.m., we heard the most aggressive, unnatural roar that I've ever heard in my entire life. I've heard the roar of bears, of leopards, even tigers. This was different. And then it did it again. It didn't sound too close, but it was enough to scare me, and it was close enough to make Rocky pee himself. The poor guy. I knew there was nothing I could do for that dog. I knew he could sense things that we couldn't. I knew we couldn't calm him down. So I just let him sit there with me, kept my hand on his shivering body, and tried to comfort him as best as I could. At 3:56 a.m., we started to hear what sounded like rocks hitting the side of the cabin, like someone was throwing them at it. A few of them hit one right after another. There'd be a pause for a couple of minutes, and then it would start all over again. Again, we prepared to light up the night and start World War III. We were ready for it to attack. I didn't know if this thing was strong enough to beat down the door, but it was sure as hell big enough and strong enough to smash through a window if it wanted to. And if it was stalking us like that and throwing rocks, there was some intelligence to this thing. I knew that if it wanted to, it'd break right through that window. And I was ready to put a bullet right between its eyes. Thankfully, though, it didn't crash through that window. Even though I was prepared for it, I wasn't ready for my life to change like that. But it did roar again. And this time, it was really close. Close enough to where I clutched my gun and said a prayer. Again, I have heard roars from most animals imaginable. This thing sounded like it came from another world. It looked like it came from another world. The sun came up and everything stopped. Rocky settled down and even gave me a couple of kisses. I think he was saying, "Thanks for keeping me safe, man. I was really scared of that thing." Well, you know what, Rocky? We were all scared of that thing. We left as soon as we could. We got back to town and caught an early flight back to the States. We haven't been back there since, but I have talked to a lot of people that have seen things like that. Lots of their stories are a lot scarier than mine. Even though, at the moment, I didn't think anything else could be scarier than what we were experiencing. But there are people out there that have come face to face with this thing. They didn't have guns. They didn't have a wall to protect them. They didn't have a dog. It was just them. So that's my story. Again, I thank you for getting me to tell you this. I'm looking forward to hearing it on your channel. And remember, everybody that's listening, If you do see something like this, or any predator out there for that matter, don't run. Back away slowly. Don't go looking for these things. Just stay the hell out of its way. Good night, Rick.